I don't talk about what happened in the Ardennes forest anymore. Not to my therapist, not to my kids, not to the guys at the VFW hall who think they understand loss because they watch their buddies take shrapnel and come home in wheelchairs. What happened to my unit was different. What happened to me afterward was something I still can't explain in any language that normal people use to describe the world. It was October when I went back, 15 years after the ambush, 15 years after I walked out of those trees as the only man standing. And I still couldn't tell you exactly why I survived when the others didn't. The army said I did everything right. The counselors said survivor's guilt was natural, expected, part of the process. But none of them had been there. None of them knew what that forest actually felt like. The way the cold came up from the ground rather than down from the sky. The way the trees grew so close together that daylight arrived filtered and grey and wrong, like light through dirty water. I drove out there alone. I didn't tell anyone where I was going because I knew what they'd say. My daughter would have cried. My doctor would have adjusted my prescription. So I packed a bag, told everyone I needed a long weekend to clear my head, and I drove 6 hours to the edge of that forest in eastern Belgium, where Sergeant Cruz and Marcus Webb and the 11 other men I served alongside all stopped being alive. I parked at the same gravel pull-off I remembered from before. The trees hadn't changed. Trees don't change the way people do. They just get bigger, quieter, more certain of themselves. The canopy had thickened over the years, and standing at the tree line, I could feel the temperature drop, maybe 4 or 5 degrees, immediate and absolute, like stepping into a building that's been closed up all summer. Except this was October, and it was already cold. I told myself I was here for closure, that word people use when they want to believe that pain has an end, that if you just face a thing directly, it loses its power over you. I had a small backpack, a flashlight, a thermos of coffee that was already going lukewarm. I had a photograph of the 13 of us taken 2 days before the ambush, all of us grinning outside a field kitchen somewhere outside Liège. I'd been carrying that photograph in my wallet for 15 years, and the faces were starting to blur at the edges from handling. I went in just before noon, thinking I'd have plenty of daylight. The forest had other ideas. Within maybe 20 minutes, the light had changed in a way I couldn't account for. Not dramatically. There were no clouds rolling in, no sudden dusk. It was more like the light became reluctant, like it was being slowly withheld. The path I was following, a narrow deer track I half remembered from 15 years ago, felt familiar in a way that made my stomach tighten. Familiar the way a bad dream feels familiar. You know you've been here before, and the knowing itself is the problem. The smells came back first. That's the thing about trauma nobody prepares you for. It's stored in the senses, not in the thinking part of your brain. I caught the smell of wet clay and pine resin, and beneath that something else I didn't want to name. Something iron-tinged and old, and my body responded before my mind could intervene. My hands started to shake. My breathing went shallow. I stopped on the path and stood very still, the way you learn to do when everything in your nervous system is screaming and you need to override it with simple, deliberate acts. I looked at my boots. I counted my breaths. I reminded myself I was alone, that it was 15 years ago, that nothing here could hurt me now. That's when I noticed my shadow. The sun was behind me and slightly to the left, coming through the trees at a low angle the way October sun does, and my shadow stretched ahead of me on the path, long and dark and perfectly normal. I stood still and looked at it, the way you look at something when your brain is trying to convince you that what you're seeing is not what you're seeing. My shadow was still. I was still, so that made sense. I hadn't moved, and neither had it. I exhaled slowly, shook my head at myself, took a step forward. My shadow didn't move with me. I stopped, took a step back. The shadow stayed exactly where it was, stretched ahead of me on the path, the shape of a man, my shape, absolutely motionless. I looked up to check the angle of the light. I looked down at my feet to confirm I was standing where I was standing. I moved my arm slowly, deliberately, out to the side. The shadow's arm did not move. I want you to understand what it feels like to have your shadow detach from you, because there's no comparison that quite captures it. It's not fear, not exactly, not at first. It's closer to the feeling of reaching for a step that isn't there, a fundamental wrongness, a violation of physics so basic that your brain simply refuses it, cycles back, tries again. I moved my arm again. I raised it above my head. I waved it back and forth like a man trying to flag down a car on an empty highway. My shadow stood completely still on the path in front of me. And then, slowly, with the deliberate, unhurried movement of something that has been waiting a very long time, it began to walk away from me into the trees. I followed it. I know how that sounds. I know the obvious thing, the same thing. The thing anyone telling this story from the outside would say you should do is walk back to your car, drive away, call someone. But when you see something that cannot exist, doing something that cannot happen, there's a part of the human brain that overrides self-preservation entirely. Not courage, not stupidity, something older than both, the need to know. The shadow moved through the trees about 30 feet ahead of me. It maintained that distance consistently, which I noticed because I tried to close it. I walked faster, and it walked faster. I stopped, and it stopped. It was responding to me, or responding to something, keeping that specific gap between us like it needed me close enough to follow, but not close enough to catch. The ground was soft from recent rain, and my boots made a sucking sound with each step, but the shadow, moving over the same ground, made nothing. Of course it made nothing. It was a shadow. Except it was moving independently of any light source and behaving like something with intention. And that meant the old rules, the comfortable rules about what shadows are and what they do, no longer applied to anything I was seeing. The trees thickened around me as I went deeper. I had my flashlight, but I didn't turn it on yet, because the gray filtered light was still just sufficient, and some part of me, some irrational but insistent part, felt that turning on the flashlight would change something, would make the shadow aware of me in a different way. So I followed in the dimness, watching that dark shape move between the trunks ahead, and I tried to control my breathing, and I tried to think clearly about what I was experiencing. My first rational explanation was a trick of light. Shadows behave strangely in dense forest, bouncing off surfaces, splitting around obstacles. But the trick of light doesn't maintain a consistent human shape. It doesn't walk with the human gait. And I kept coming back to this, it doesn't stop when you stop and start when you start. My second rational explanation was that I was having some kind of dissociative episode. My therapist had mentioned this possibility years ago in the context of my PTSD, the way extreme stress could cause perceptual disturbances. But I was not under extreme stress when I entered the forest. I was anxious, yes, and sad, but I was lucid. I knew where I was. I knew what year it was. I was having a conversation with myself about the nature of what I was seeing, which is not what dissociation feels like. Dissociation feels like watching yourself from the ceiling. This felt like being more present than I had been in years. Every sense pushed to its absolute limit. The world around me almost unbearably vivid and real. I had no third rational explanation. The shadow led me for what I estimated was about 20 minutes, though time moves strangely in those states of heightened awareness, and it could have been 10 or 40. Then it stopped. I stopped too, about 30 feet back, and looked at where we were. I recognized it immediately. The recognition hit me in the chest like something physical, a pressure that made me actually take a step backward and put my hand against the nearest tree to steady myself. We were in the small clearing, the one with the shallow depression in the ground, where the stream ran in wet seasons, the one with the 3 massive beaches on the northern side that I had used as a reference point when I was trying to get my bearings 15 years ago. Running. The only one running. The sound of everything behind me that I have never been able to fully describe to anyone. This was where it happened. The ambush. This was the specific ground. I stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at the shadow in the center of it. And the shadow was no longer shaped like me. It took me a moment to understand what I was seeing, because my mind did not want to process it. The shape was wrong. Too wide across the shoulders, different height, the posture not mine. And then I understood that it was not supposed to be me. The shape was standing the way Marcus Webb used to stand, with that slide forward lean he had, weight on the balls of his feet, always ready to move. Marcus had been 6'2" and built like something carved from old wood, and even in silhouette, even as a shadow with no features and no face, I knew him. 15 years, and I knew him instantly. I said his name out loud. I don't know why. It came out very quiet, barely above a whisper. The way you say something when you're not sure you want the universe to hear you saying it. The shadow that looked like Marcus Webb raised one arm slowly and pointed to the eastern tree line. Then it collapsed. Not gradually, not the way a person falls when they're tired or hurt. It collapsed the way Marcus actually fell, all at once, everything giving out simultaneously, dropping straight down without any of the adjustments a living body makes on its way to the ground. I had seen it 15 years ago from 40 feet away, and I had never stopped seeing it. Not in 15 years of therapy and medication, and long silences in rooms with people who were trying to help me. And now I was watching it again, and my legs stopped working, and I went down onto my knees on the wet ground at the edge of the clearing. I knelt there, and I looked at the place where the shadow had been, and the ground was empty. And then from the eastern tree line, exactly where the shadow of Marcus Webb had pointed before it fell, I heard a sound that I had also not stopped hearing in 15 years. Footsteps, multiple sets, moving through dead leaves with the specific rhythm of men who are trying to be quiet and are not quite managing it. And a second shadow stepped out from between the trees. I knew who it was before the shape fully emerged from the tree-lined shadow. Sergeant Cruz walked a certain way that nobody who served under him ever forgot. This deliberate, unhurried stride that somehow covered ground faster than it should have, like the space between his steps was longer than physics allowed. We used to joke about it. Webb used to do an impression that made everyone lose it. This exaggerated slow motion walk, while Cruz stood there shaking his head, trying not to smile. I hadn't thought about that in years. I hadn't let myself think about it. The shadow of Sergeant Cruz moved to the center of the clearing and stood there, and I was still on my knees at the tree line, hands pressed into the cold, wet ground. And I want to be honest about what I was feeling, because I think people expect the dominant emotion in a moment like that to be terror. And terror was present, yes, somewhere underneath everything else. This low, constant vibration, like a note played too low to hear, but not too low to feel in your chest. But what was bigger than the terror, what was actually making it hard to breathe, was grief. 15 years of grief that I had managed and medicated and talked about in careful clinical language suddenly had nowhere to hide, and it came up all at once, physical and enormous. I pressed the back of my hand against my mouth and I watched. Cruz moved through the clearing the way he had moved through it 15 years ago, and I remembered it. I remembered all of it. I had simply not allowed myself to remember, and now I had no choice. He went to the low ground by the stream depression, crouching, checking the terrain the way he always did, methodical and calm. He was trying to identify the direction of fire. I remembered this. I remembered watching him do exactly this while everything was happening around us. This insane stillness he had in the middle of chaos. This absolute refusal to panic that I had found both inspiring and slightly inhuman in the 18 months I served under him. The shadow of Sergeant Cruz stood up slowly from the crouch. Then it snapped backward. Hard and sudden, the way a puppet moves when the string is jerked from above, and it hit the ground and it did not move again. I made a sound I was not aware I was making until I heard it. This low, broken sound that didn't seem to belong to me, that seemed to be coming from somewhere deeper than the part of me that makes decisions. I pushed myself up from my knees and I stood. And I told myself very clearly and very quietly that I needed to leave. That I needed to turn around and walk back the way I came and get to my car and drive away from this forest and never come back. I told myself this the way you talk to someone in shock, slow and simple and direct. I did not leave. I have tried to explain this to myself in the years since, and I have never fully managed it. Part of it was the grief, which had its own gravity now and was pulling me toward the clearing rather than away from it. Part of it was something else, something harder to name. A sense that these shadows were showing me something I was supposed to see, completing something that had been left unfinished for 15 years. And part of it, the part I like least to admit, was that I was seeing my dad again, moving and present and close enough that I could have crossed a clearing and stood where they stood. After 15 years of photographs blurring at the edges, I was not capable of walking away from that. A third shadow came from the northern side between the beaches. Kowalski. I knew him by the way he carried his arms slightly away from his body, this particular posture he had that we gave him grief about constantly, asking him if his arms were too muscular to hang straight, which they actually nearly were. Kowalski was 23 years old when he died, and he had been planning to open a gym back home in Scranton, and he had showed me the business plan once, handwritten in a green notebook, and I had told him it looked solid because it did, and because he had needed to hear it. The shadow of Kowalski moved to the western edge of the clearing and crouched behind the root system of a fallen tree. The same fallen tree. It was still there, 15 years later, further decayed but still there. And the shadow took the same position Kowalski had taken that day, trying to establish a defensive angle, trying to do the right thing in an impossible situation. I watched it for maybe 30 seconds, then it came apart. That is the only way I can describe what I saw. The shadow didn't fall the way the others had fallen. It fragmented, briefly, at the edges, like smoke dispersing in wind, and then collapsed. And I understood, in a way that bypassed rational thought entirely and went straight into something more primitive, that what I was watching was not just a reenactment. The shadows were not simply falling. They were dying the specific way each man had died. And whatever was driving this knew the difference, had access to a record of those final moments that I had spent 15 years trying to bury deeply enough that it would stop surfacing in the 3 o'clock darkness of my bedroom. 4 more shadows came. They came quickly now, not one at a time but in a group, emerging from different points around the clearing, and I recognized each of them with that same immediate, gut-level certainty that had nothing to do with visible features or faces. Rodriguez, who was from Albuquerque and who could sleep anywhere, including once in a running vehicle on a dirt road. Pemberton, the youngest of us, 19 years old, who had a younger sister he talked about constantly in the specific, reverent way that only brothers talk about sisters. Okafor and Chen together, because they had been paired together so often on watch that they had developed a kind of shorthand communication that the rest of us only half understood. They moved through the clearing, and they died in it, each one in sequence, each one specific. And I stood at the tree line, and I watched all of it, and I did not look away. I owed them that much. I had looked away once, 15 years ago, not from cowardice, but from necessity, because looking away was the thing that had kept me alive. I had run, and I had not looked back, and I had survived, and then I had spent 15 years not looking at any of it. I was looking now. When the 6th shadow fell, the clearing went very still. The grey light had flattened further, and the temperature had dropped, and I realized I had been in the forest for much longer than 20 minutes. The quality of the cold had changed. This was late afternoon cold, moving toward evening cold, and I had not turned on my flashlight, and I could not find my thermos, and my knees were soaked through from kneeling on the wet ground. I counted. 6 shadows, 6 deaths, 6 of the 13, which meant 7 more were coming. And then I realized, in a way that sent something cold and entirely separate from the temperature moving up through my chest and into my throat, that 13 was the wrong number to be thinking about. There had been 14 of us in that clearing, 13 dead and 1 who ran. and I was standing at the edge of the clearing watching shadows die, and I had not yet seen my own shadow since I followed it into these trees. I looked down at the ground at my feet. The ground was empty. No shadow. In the dim late afternoon light, standing at the forest's edge, I cast nothing. I was a man standing in a forest in October, and I threw no shadow at all. And from somewhere very close behind me, I heard breathing that was not mine. I turned around slowly. I want to be precise about the slowly, because it was not the slowness of calm or deliberation. It was the slowness of a body that has received information it cannot process and is operating at reduced capacity while the processing catches up. My hands were at my sides, and I turned on my right heel, and I looked at what was behind me. Nothing. Trees. The path I had followed into the clearing, stretching back between the trunks into the dimness, empty in both directions, as far as the failing light allowed me to see. The breathing had stopped the moment I began to turn, as if whatever was producing it had anticipated the movement and adjusted accordingly. That anticipation was worse than the sound itself. A random noise in a dark forest is frightening. A noise that responds to your behavior with what can only be described as awareness is something else entirely. Something that operates in a different category of fear, deeper and more destabilizing. I stood with my back to the clearing and I listened. The forest gave me wind, very slight, moving through the upper canopy with a sound like distant water. It gave me the creak of a branch somewhere to the north, the specific rhythmic creak of wood under pressure. It gave me my own heartbeat, which I could feel in my ears and my throat and the tips of my fingers. It gave me nothing else. Whatever had been breathing behind me had decided to be silent and patient, and the silence and patience of it were somehow more threatening than any sound it could have made. I turned back to the clearing. The seventh shadow was already there. This one was not moving through the clearing the way the others had. It was standing at the far edge, at the southern tree line, perfectly still. And it was facing me. Not facing the direction of the original fire, not crouching or maneuvering or doing any of the things the other shadows had done. It was simply standing at the opposite edge of the clearing and looking at me across the open ground between us. And I used the word looking deliberately, despite the fact that it had no eyes, no face, nothing that should have been capable of directional attention. But attention has a quality that you can feel even when you cannot see it. A pressure, a weight. And this shadow's attention was pointed at me with an intensity that I felt physically, like standing too close to something very hot. I did not recognize this one. That sounds like it should have been a relief. After 6 shadows I had known intimately, after 6 specific deaths I had watched with my hands pressed to my mouth, after 6 men I had eaten and slept and operated alongside and then failed to save. Not recognizing this 7th shape should have meant something neutral. It did not mean something neutral. It meant something worse. Because I had known all 13 of the men who died in that clearing, and if this shadow did not belong to any of them, then the question of who it belonged to had only one remaining answer. I looked at it across the clearing for a long time, long enough that the light shifted again, the gray deepening towards something with more blue in it, the specific blue-gray of forest dusk that I remembered from the night after the ambush. from lying in a Belgian field hospital listening to sounds I could not identify and waiting to find out how many of me was still intact. The shadow raised one arm, the same gesture the shadow of Marcus Webb had made hours ago, that slow, deliberate pointing. But Webb's shadow had pointed to the eastern tree line, indicating where the others would come from. This shadow pointed directly at me. My flashlight was in my right hand. I don't remember taking it out of my pack. I turned it on. The beam cut across the clearing and illuminated dead leaves and exposed root systems and the dark trunks of beech trees, and absolutely nothing else. No shadow. In the direct beam of my flashlight, with light now coming from my direction, there should have been a shadow stretching away from me across the clearing. There was not. I was still casting nothing. The light went across the ground in front of me in a clean, uninterrupted beam and hit the far tree line without any interruption in the shape of a man. I moved the flashlight to the right, to the left. I turned completely around and shone it behind me. The beam picked out individual trees, the texture of bark, the wet gleam of fallen leaves, a spiderweb catching the light for a moment like something briefly precious. No shadow, anywhere. Just a man standing in a forest with a flashlight and no shadow, and behind him a clearing full of places where shadows had been. I thought, with a clarity that surprised me given everything, about the photograph in my wallet. The 13 of them and me, grinning outside the field kitchen. And I thought about what it means to be the one who is in the photograph, but not in the ground. What it means to keep living inside a life that was supposed to end in a forest in Belgium 15 years ago, and didn't, for reasons that have never been adequately explained by anything the army, or my therapist, or my own relentless internal accounting has ever offered me. Survivor's guilt, they call it. As if guilt is the whole of it. As if guilt even begins to describe the specific texture of carrying 13 deaths inside a life that was supposed to be yours. I walked into the clearing. I don't know what I was looking for. The rational answer is that I was not looking for anything. That rational thought had largely vacated the premises by this point, and I was operating on something older and more direct. I walked to the center of the clearing, to the spot where the stream depression was, where the ground was lowest and the cold came up more strongly. And I stood there, and I turned off my flashlight. The dark came in immediately, absolute and total. The kind of dark that cities have made people forget is possible. A dark with physical weight and texture. I stood in it and I waited, and I breathed, and the cold came up through the soles of my boots. Then the sound started. Not the breathing from before. These were different sounds, specific sounds. Sounds that I recognized with the same gut-level immediacy with which I had recognized each shadow. They were the sounds of that day, not dramatic sounds, not the sounds that feature in movies about combat. The real sounds, the ones that stay with you precisely because they are not what you expected. The sounds that fit into no existing category your brain has prepared for them, and so get stored, raw, unprocessed, in some chamber that normal memory cannot reach, but that opens without warning in the 3 o'clock dark. I heard Pemberton's voice, not words, just his voice, the specific register of it, mid-sentence, cut off. I heard the sound the leaves made under Kowalski's weight when he went down. I heard Cruz, who never in 18 months raised his voice above a certain controlled volume, make a sound I had never heard him make before or after. A single syllable of pure surprise. I heard my own voice from 15 years ago, saying something I have never been able to remember clearly, something short and probably useless. And then the sound of my own boots on wet leaves, going fast, going away. I had never heard myself run before. From the outside, from the perspective of the men I was leaving behind. I stood in the dark center of that clearing and I listened to myself run, and I finally, after 15 years, understood what the forest had brought me here to do. Not to witness the deaths, not to receive some supernatural absolution or accusation. Something quieter than either of those things, and in some ways more difficult. I was here to stop running. I opened my mouth in the absolute dark of that clearing, in the cold coming up from Belgian ground, surrounded by the sounds of 15 years ago, and I started to talk. Not to myself, to them, to Cruz and Webb and Kowalski and Rodriguez and Pemberton and Okafor and Chen and the 6 others whose specific last moments I had just been shown in shadow on the ground where they happened. I talked for a long time, and when I finally stopped, the sounds had gone quiet, and the clearing was just a clearing, and I was just a man standing in the dark in a forest in October. But when I turned my flashlight back on and looked down at the ground, my shadow was back, stretching behind me, the right shape, the right size, moving correctly when I moved. And it was not alone. There were 13 of them, 13 shadows stretching out behind me on the clearing floor, arranged the way shadows arrange themselves when the light source is single and direct. All of them pointing away from my flashlight beam in the same direction, overlapping slightly at the edges. A dark fan of shapes spread across the wet leaves and exposed roots. Mine was at the front. The others were behind it, each one distinct, each one the right size and proportion for the man it belonged to. And they were all completely still. I stood and I looked at them for a long time without moving, because I understood instinctively that moving was going to change something, and I was not yet ready for whatever that change would be. The flashlight beam was steady in my hand, steadier than I would have expected given that my hand was the hand of a man who had just spent several hours in a forest watching the dead move. And I held it, and I breathed, and I looked at 13 shadows that had no source. Cruz was the one directly behind mine. I knew it, without being able to explain how I knew it. The same way I had known each shadow all evening. That immediate, bone-deep recognition that bypassed every rational filter. His shadow was the right height, the right build, and it had that quality of stillness he had always carried, even in death apparently. Even as a shadow with no body and no face, and no existence that fit any framework I had ever been given for understanding the world. I said his name again, the same way I had said Webb's name hours ago, quiet and uncertain, a man testing whether the universe is listening. The shadow of Sergeant Cruz moved forward, not dramatically, not with any of the sudden wrongness that had characterized the shadow deaths I had watched earlier. It simply stepped forward until it was alongside my shadow rather than behind it, the way you step up beside someone you are walking with. And then it was still again. I exhaled a breath I felt like I had been holding for 15 years. One by one, over the next several minutes, the other shadows moved. Each one came forward in its own time, at its own pace, with its own specific quality of movement that I recognized from the living men they had belonged to. Rodriguez moved quickly, decisive and efficient, the way he had done everything. Pemberton hesitated for a moment before moving, which was so perfectly him, so precisely the 19-year-old who had always needed one extra second to commit, that I made the sound again, the low, broken sound from earlier, and had to press my free hand over my eyes for a moment before I could continue looking. They arranged themselves around my shadow, not behind it anymore, around it. A loose circle of dark shapes on the Belgian forest floor, surrounding the shadow of the man who had run, and the arrangement did not feel accusatory. I want to be very clear about that, because I think it is the most important thing I have to tell you about that night. After everything I had seen, after all the years of 3 o'clock darkness, and the photograph of the blurring faces, and the sound of my own boots running that I had finally heard from the outside, the arrangement of those shadows around mine did not feel like accusation or judgment or the working out of some supernatural accounting. It felt like company. I sat down on the ground in the center of the clearing. Just sat down, cross-legged on the wet leaves, the way you sit when you have been standing for too long and your legs finally make the decision for you. I set the flashlight down, pointing upward, so it threw a diffuse light across the clearing, and I looked at the shadows around me, and I talked some more. I told them things I had never told anyone. Not the therapist, not my daughter, not the man at the VFW who thought they understood. I told them about the 15 years, about what it had cost, and what it had broken, and what had managed to survive the breaking. I told Pemberton that I had looked up his sister once, years ago, not to make contact, but just to know, and that she had become a teacher in the same town where they had grown up, and that she looked happy in her photographs. I told Kowalski that the gym idea had been genuinely solid, and that I had always meant to tell him that more clearly than I had. I told Cruz that I had tried to lead the way he led, in the parts of my life where leading had been asked of me, and that I was not sure I had managed it, but that I had tried. I talked until the cold became something I could no longer manage by ignoring it, until my fingers had gone from uncomfortable to genuinely numb, and the damp from the ground had soaked through my clothing, and my thermos, when I finally found it in my pack, was stone cold. I drank the cold coffee anyway. I'm not sure why. It seemed important to do something ordinary. When I finally looked up from the thermos, the shadows had changed again. They were fading, not disappearing suddenly, not winking out, but fading the way shadows fade when light changes, gradually losing density, the outlines becoming less certain, the shapes softening at the edges. I watched it happen, and I did not try to stop it, because I understood that this was the end of what the forest had needed to do, and that stopping it was not something I was capable of or entitled to attempt. I just watched. I had gotten reasonably good in the last few hours at watching things I could not change. The last one to go was Cruz. Of course it was Cruz. He had always been the last one to leave any position, always the one who stayed until he was certain everyone else was clear. A habit so ingrained it had apparently persisted past the point where habits should be able to persist. His shadow held its shape and its density after the others had gone entirely. Just his outline on the ground beside mine. And then it too began to soften and disperse and thin. And I watched it go, the way you watch something you know you will not see again, trying to hold the image clearly enough that it will stay. It went. My shadow remained. Alone on the ground, the right shape, the right size, moving when I moved, and stopping when I stopped. Normal, ordinary, the shadow of a man sitting in a forest in October with cold coffee and numb hands, and 15 years of carried weight that felt, in some way I cannot fully quantify or defend, different than it had felt when I walked in. Not gone. I want to be honest about that. Not resolved in any clean or complete way. Not fixed by a night in a forest, with shadows that should not have existed. The weight was still there. The 3 o'clock dark would still come, probably. And the photograph would still be in my wallet. And Pemberton would still be 19 years old forever, in a way that I would never stop finding unbearable. But different, shifted somehow. The way a thing you have been carrying alone becomes different when you set it down, even briefly, even in the company of people who are no longer capable of helping you carry it. The setting down itself changes something. The acknowledgement that you have been carrying it. I got up from the ground. My knees were stiff, and my back had made its displeasure known, and I was cold in a way that was going to take a hot shower and several hours to fully address. I picked up my flashlight and my pack. I found the path back without difficulty, which surprised me, given how disoriented I had become going in. But the forest seemed different now, less withheld, the light from my flashlight reaching further than it should have. I walked out. At the tree line, I stopped and turned back once. The clearing was dark and empty and completely still. Just a small open space in a Belgian forest where the ground was low and the cold came up, and 3 beeches grew on the northern side. Nothing moving, no shadows, just trees and dark, and the sound of wind in the upper canopy. I put my hand up, not quite a wave, something between a wave and a salute, neither gesture exactly, something that didn't have a name because the situation it was responding to didn't have a name. Then I walked to my car and I drove home. I never went back. I never told anyone. Until now. Until this moment of telling you. And I've thought carefully about whether telling it does anything to it. Whether putting it into words and sending it out into the world changes the nature of what happened, or cheapens it, or makes it less precisely true. I don't think it does. I think some things are large enough to survive being told. I think the 13 of them, wherever they are, in whatever sense that question has an answer, are large enough to survive it. I still carry the photograph. The faces aren't blurring anymore. I don't know how to explain that except to say that it's true. That the photograph looks clearer now than it has in years. Like something that was slightly out of focus has been, quietly, without my noticing exactly when, adjusted. I take that for what it is. I don't ask for more than that.